Welcome to the Iran 1400 Project podcast, where we explore the past, present, and possible futures of Iran through informed dialogue, independent thought, and diverse voices. From historical insight to emerging narratives, we connect ideas to action in the pursuit of a more just, inclusive, and forward-looking society. Join us as we rethink Iran's trajectory, one conversation at a time.
Today, we're plunging into a topic that's, complex, crucial, and constantly shifting. It's the fascinating story of political currents and public trust in Iran. Our mission for this deep dive is to unpack how the relationship between the Iranian people and political parties has transformed since the 1979 revolution. From that initial fervor to today's rather fractured landscape. We'll be drawing from a really insightful piece by Vafa Mostakim titled Political Currents and Public Trust: The Rise and Rupture of Partisan Politics in Iran 1400 Project.
Right. And what's fascinating here, I think, is how this deep dive will not only trace those historical shifts, but also really examine how partisan politics have both shaped and ultimately eroded the public's trust in governance. This isn't just looking back at history. It's about understanding these powerful cycles of hope and then, disillusionment that have profoundly defined an entire nation's political identity.
Okay, let's unpack this first period then. The revolutionary zeal. Say 1979 to about 1997. After the 79 Islamic Revolution, we saw the monarchy dismantled and this hybrid theocratic republican constitution put in place. How did this new system actually manage to consolidate power so effectively in those early years?
Well, initially there was indeed broad public support. Political participation was very high. Ayatollah Khomeini consolidated power through key institutions. You had the Revolutionary Council, the Islamic Republican Party, the IRP, and of course the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards. And even during this period, internal factions were debating policies within the new regime. There was a kind of nascent pluralism, you could say.
But that initial pluralism, as the source points out, sounds like it was pretty short-lived. What were the immediate triggers or maybe the underlying forces that led to dissent being suppressed so quickly?
Yeah, the regime moved fast to suppress dissent from secular groups, leftist groups, nationalist groups. And we saw conservative social policies emerge quite rapidly, things like compulsory veiling, restrictions on civil liberties. It effectively created a new social order. A new political elite rose to power, mainly clerics and loyal lay Islamists. The IRP became dominant for a time, though it was actually dissolved in 1987. But the internal factions that formed within it, they'd already taken root by then. I think the core insight here is that while the revolution promised freedom, the consolidation of power quickly prioritized ideological conformity over genuine political pluralism. And that really set an early precedent for how dissent would be handled later on.
Right. Given what we've discussed about consolidation, one thing that really stands out in the source is the powerful role of populism under Khomeini. How did his rhetoric specifically manage to mobilize so many people, particularly the poor?
Khomeini's rhetoric was incredibly effective. He mobilized the poor by promising anti-imperialism, social justice, and revolutionary institutions like the Basij militia offered tangible rewards for loyalty, access to services, jobs, that sort of thing. And look, it's important to remember the 1980s did see notable improvements in health and education for many Iranians that definitely contributed to the initial support. However, these gains came at a significant cost: the systematic erosion of political freedom and any kind of open debate.
That's a fascinating paradox, tangible gains in some areas, but this tightening grip politically. Did the source offer any insights into how the regime managed that trade-off, or how the public reconciled it at the time?
The source indicates that the emphasis shifted pretty quickly from those broad revolutionary ideals to a much more rigid ideological control. The trade-off was, frankly, largely enforced, and while social programs helped alleviate some immediate needs, the actual political space for expressing grievances was shrinking rapidly.
Okay. And then came a significant economic shift under President Rafsanjani after the war. Beyond just the reforms themselves, what were the less obvious, maybe unintended social and political consequences, particularly for public trust?
Right. Rafsanjani emphasized privatization and free market reforms. This was part of the post-war reconstruction effort.
Yeah.
Now, while these policies certainly enriched a new capitalist class often connected to clerical and military networks, mind you, they also really exacerbated inequality and inflation for the wider population. And this led to public unrest, even riots in the mid-1990s. It clearly revealed growing dissatisfaction. I think the crucial insight here is how this kind of top-down economic liberalization, even if intended for reconstruction, inadvertently deepened social divides. It eroded trust by creating very visible economic winners and losers, often tied directly to political power. So this period fundamentally set the stage for future disillusionment, as the regime's conservative cultural agenda increasingly clashed with a society that was becoming more urban, educated, and frankly, more secular.
So this period of growing dissatisfaction really sets the stage for a new chapter, the reformist era. It starts with Mohammad Khatami's landslide victory in 1997. That win must have signaled just immense promise of change. What was the public truly hoping for when they threw their support behind him?
Oh, absolutely. His win represented a profound, renewed belief in the possibility of reform from within the system. People were hoping for greater civil liberties, the rule of law, a more open society. Definitely. His emphasis on civil society and press freedom genuinely energized students, women, the middle class. And for a brief, quite vibrant period, newspapers flourished, political discourse really expanded, and formal political parties proliferated under frameworks like the House of Parties. It really felt like an opening.
But as the source explains, this optimism then ran headfirst into what's described as conservative retrenchment. What were the main obstacles that really thwarted these reform efforts? And how did that impact the public's renewed sense of hope?
Well, the unelected institutions, specifically the Guardian Council, the judiciary, and the security forces, they systematically obstructed these reforms. It was quite deliberate. We saw the rapid closure of reformist newspapers, arrests of activists, and then the brutal suppression of the 1999 student protests. This just demonstrated the clear limits of electoral politics within that existing structure. And Khatami's reluctance, perhaps inability, to forcefully defend protesters ultimately alienated many of his own supporters. Plus, his movement struggled to bridge existing class divides or present a truly unified, actionable vision. So yeah, this period of reform, while sparking immense hope, ultimately ran into a brick wall of conservative power. It became another significant chapter in these cycles of hope and disillusionment we're tracing.
Right, which leads us pretty directly to the current era, marked by hardliner ascendancy starting around 2005. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's presidency marked a significant return to authoritarian populism. What did that actually look like for ordinary Iranians on the ground?
Ahmadinejad very skillfully appealed to the poor and the marginalized, using populist rhetoric. However, his administration simultaneously deepened the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' economic and political dominance quite significantly. And while he promised anti-corruption efforts, he actually facilitated rather opaque privatization deals. He also deepened clientelist networks. That's basically a system where political loyalty gets rewarded with economic favors, which further entrenched corruption and reduced fair opportunities for most people.
That definitely sounds like a recipe for deeper public resentment. And a particularly striking moment for public trust occurred with his 2009 re-election, didn't it? How deeply did that event resonate, and what was the immediate fallout?
Oh, hugely. That re-election was widely viewed as fraudulent, both inside and outside Iran. It instantly sparked the Green Movement. This movement galvanized millions across the country. They were demanding electoral transparency, civil rights, and social media played a key role, despite heavy state censorship. The regime's response was brutal repression, mass arrests, pervasive surveillance. So while the movement powerfully exposed the regime's fragility and the public's deep discontent, it also starkly highlighted the opposition's lack of, institutional power to actually bring about change. That was incredibly disheartening for everyone involved.
Yeah, that's a sobering reality. It really makes you wonder how much resilience a society can have under those kinds of conditions. The source talks about these cycles of false hope. Can you maybe elaborate on how this played out through the presidencies of Ahmadinejad and then his successor, Hassan Rouhani? What legacy did that leave?
Well, despite their clear ideological differences, both presidencies tragically failed to bridge that growing rift between the state and society. It just got wider. Ahmadinejad's populism, it devolved into severe mismanagement and repression by the end. Then Rouhani, he was elected on promises of moderation and engagement, particularly with the West. But unfortunately, he ended up overseeing both the 2017-2018 protests and the really brutal crackdown of November 2019. And despite that initial optimism after the 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA everyday life actually worsened significantly under his presidency. That was due to crippling sanctions coming back, runaway inflation, and continued political repression. Nothing really improved for ordinary people. So the core insight from these cycles of false hope is this profound, almost generational disillusionment. It happens when popular movements and even electoral victories repeatedly fail to translate into tangible, lasting change. It led to a complete crisis of legitimacy in the whole political system.
Wow, this recurring pattern sounds incredibly frustrating for the public. How did these repeated cycles of hope and betrayal fundamentally reshape public perception of the entire political system? Were there specific moments that really crystallized this disillusionment?
Yeah, these repeated cycles gave rise to a powerful, widespread, popular refrain you started hearing everywhere. Reformists, principalists, the game is over. And this isn't just rejecting specific factions like the reformists trying to change things from within or the principalists representing the conservative hardline establishment. It's really a rejection of the legitimacy of the entire partisan framework within the Islamic Republic, the whole game. So even relatively moderate figures like Masoud Pezeshkian, who appeared in the 2024-2025 political arena, they're met with just deep public skepticism. They're seen as fundamentally incapable of structural change within the existing system. The disillusionment is just that comprehensive now.
That raises a really important question. If it's not individual presidents or factions, who do Iranians tend to attribute this recurring failure to, according to the source?
Many attribute it not merely to individual presidents or their specific policies, but really to Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei's long-standing strategy. His strategy has been to consolidate authority across all the unelected institutions, the judiciary, the Guardian Council, the security forces. And this has effectively created a system where real power is insulated from public accountability, insulated from electoral outcomes, which makes any true reform from within feel, well, impossible to a lot of the public.
Okay, let's shift our focus slightly. Let's turn our attention to the opposition outside Iran. Given this really constrained domestic landscape we've described, what role have exile opposition groups and these sort of heritage political parties played, and how relevant are they actually seen inside Iran today?
Well, while the domestic political space became severely constrained, groups like the Old Tudeh Party, the Mojahedin-e-Khalq, or MEK, and various monarchist factions, often led by figures like Reza Pahlavi, they certainly attempted to maintain influence from abroad, and they retained some symbolic capital from earlier historical struggles, no doubt. However, the source indicates they face pretty widespread skepticism inside Iran now. Many are just seen as out of touch, too fragmented, or particularly in the case of the MEK, tarnished by controversial past alliances, like their ties to Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq War. That history doesn't just go away, so their historical legacy doesn't necessarily translate into current legitimacy for many Iranians today.
Right, so it sounds like these diaspora coalitions haven't been as effective as perhaps they or others hoped in uniting the opposition. What's prevented them from gaining more traction or widespread support inside the country?
They've certainly tried to unify opposition under banners like regime change and democratic transition, often using digital platforms quite actively. However, things like institutional disconnection from the realities on the ground, a lack of transparent structures within their own organizations, and persistent ideological rifts, well, they've significantly limited their effectiveness. What's really crucial to understand, I think, is that among the youth and the grassroots movements inside Iran today, political affiliation, even to an opposition group, is now often seen as a liability, not really a badge of legitimacy. What people seem to demand now is ethical alignment, civic accountability, and truly inclusive representation, something that transcends those traditional party lines.
Okay, so all of this history seems to culminate in something potentially quite profound and maybe different: the woman life freedom movement. How did the 2022 protests following the tragic death of Masajina Amini mark such a distinct and inclusive wave of dissent? What set it apart from previous movements?
Absolutely. This movement felt profoundly different. It was characterized by just unprecedented cross-class and cross-ethnic solidarity. It signaled a deep, profound shift away from traditional partisan politics towards what you might call civic resistance. The youth, especially those under 30, very visibly distanced themselves from traditional opposition groups. They rejected both the regime factions and the established reformist factions. Their activism emphasized universal human dignity, personal agency, and these non-ideological forms of solidarity. It felt very grassroots, very organic. This is a very significant development, I believe. It suggests perhaps a new path forward for activism and change in Iran.
So wrapping this up, what does this deep dive into Iran's political currents ultimately mean for the country itself?
Well, it would connect this to the bigger picture. Iran's political trajectory reflects this deepening rupture between state institutions and societal aspirations. It's a huge gap. The formal political arena, which is dominated by these sanctioned factions, it just no longer represents the hopes or aspirations of the majority. The crucial insight, I think, is that the crisis of legitimacy isn't just about specific policies or leaders anymore. It's about the entire framework of power.
It really sounds like young Iranians are creating something entirely new, almost like a new political language or identity, maybe.
I think they are. They're actively crafting a new civic identity. It seems centered on ethics, on truth, on participatory resistance, rather than that traditional ideological alignment or partisan loyalty we've seen fail so many times. It's a powerful shift toward what the source calls establishing moral groundwork.
This presents both a huge challenge and maybe an opportunity for Iran's future. Can the country move beyond this deep-seated factionalism towards something more inclusive, maybe a bottom-up political renewal? Or does this growing rupture portend something else entirely?
That's really the core question that the source leaves us grappling with, isn't it? It suggests the future of Iran might not lie in new political parties, not in the traditional sense anyway, but maybe in a completely new paradigm of engagement, one that fundamentally redefines power, responsibility, and belonging right from the ground up. The challenge ahead isn't just regime change, but what the source terms regime replacement with civic legitimacy. That's the key part, because without that moral groundwork and those truly participatory institutions that people are now demanding, any potential collapse risks descending into chaos rather than achieving clarity or real progress.
A powerful thought indeed to leave you with. In a world that's craving genuine connection and ethical governance everywhere, what could be the role of a new civic identity, one born from collective disillusionment, in actually shaping a nation's future? Something for you to mull over until our next deep dive.
Thank you for listening to the Iran 1400 Project podcast. The Iran 1400 Project invites scholars, experts, and intellectuals to share their assessment of the evolution of institutions and ideas during the past 100 years to inspire a vision of Iran in the 1400s. If you found today's episode thought-provoking, be sure to subscribe, share, and continue the conversation. For more content and upcoming events, visit Iran1400.org. Until next time, stay engaged, stay informed, and stay hopeful.